Welcome to today's lecture on trade dynamics in East Africa. Join us as we explore insights into the EU Economic Partnership Agreement with Mr. Alfred K'Ombudo, Principal Secretary to the Ministry of Trade.
I'm told to speak about the Kenya-EU Economic Partnership Agreement and what does it mean in reality. But since I'm also told that you're students of East Africa integration, then I guess the core of your interest is situating this agreement in the context of a prior commitment that Kenya has to advance integration through the East African community. And I think what I've been told is that you are interested in finding out the implications of what it means to have an EU Economic Partnership Agreement in the context of our prior commitments in the EAC. Given that you're students of integration, given that you're students of EAC, I will probably not go into the journey towards formulating the customs union in 2010, the evolution of the East African Customs Management Act, which ceded Kenya's sovereignty to basically the EAC insofar as customs management is concerned. And then, of course, came in 2010 the common market, which, in addition to goods, then brought in other factors of production, including services, the movement of capital, and other factors that are also part of our integration journey. I will assume that you're well aware of that, and so I will not go too deeply into that. I'll get into a bit of context as regards the EU agreement. Who knows what percent of Kenya's exports in goods goes to the European Union? Guesses welcome. It's 21%. So a fifth of everything we export in terms of goods goes to the European Union. How many countries are there in the EU? 27 countries. What's the GDP of the EU? It's 14 trillion euros. I always make sure I use euros when I'm talking about the EU, but it's $18 trillion. So where I'm going with this is that this is a market you cannot ignore. And this is a market where, as you will see from my presentation, we are merely scratching the surface of, and we need to basically ensure that we put in place measures to exercise it, even as we continue trading with the EAC and other parts of the world. Another thing that is contextual is that the structure of our economy is changing. We've been sending out goods all the way from the East African industries days, from the 60s and 70s. We have large markets within the community, and they'll continue being our large and primary markets. But also have in mind that the structure of our economy is changing. And with a changing structure of your economy, you are going to probably produce different things. And you're also probably having to sell to new people in addition to the ones that you've been always selling to. I'll give you an example. Our total exports last year for goods was about $7 billion. Our export performance has been a bit flat over the last 10 years. A very interesting statistic, and maybe this is something I would invite you to do more research on, is that our exports of services was about $6.3 billion. And it is growing at a rate of more than 10% per annum. I think that in a few years' time, Kenya shall be exporting more services than it exports goods. And what's the implication of that? It means that what it takes to export changes. It means that the skills to export change. It also means that your customers could change. Because if you look at the demographic structures of places like the European continent, where you have older, richer societies, you also have a situation whereby there is lack of availability of services. But at the same time, migration is becoming a big political issue, isn't it? So how do you meet services demand to propel the economy in a situation whereby migration is a hot topic? Come in things like BPOs, comes in things like digital exports, and comes in being able to export without the movement of the natural person. And so some of these developments are also what is going to define how Kenya exports in the future, what opportunities are open, even as we maintain our traditional exports to our markets. Now, that is the context within which I wanted us to ask ourselves why we prioritized and entered into an economic partnership agreement with the European Union. A bit of context there is that I could share with you, and my office wanted me to carry my iPad, but sometimes I'm a bit more comfortable with paper. I wanted to share with you a bit of the history of this agreement. I believe the negotiation started around 2002. And as students of law, you do know that there are ways of exporting into the EU. If you're an LDC, you can, or a least developed country, you can export through something known as the Everything But Arms initiative that gives you quota-free, duty-free access, except for arms. If you are a middle-income country, it's a bit different. And then you probably have to go through something known as a general system of preferences, which allows you up to a certain percentage, and so on and so forth. But as your economy is also growing, then the importing country says, but you're doing well. We also need to have a conversation that is based on mutual benefits and not a one-way traffic. So Kenya is not the only country in the world that then has to move away from the EBA agreements. It's also affecting countries like Bangladesh. And I'll get into Bangladesh a bit shortly, because Bangladesh is a country that previously was an LDC, that now is probably going to exit that status in 2026, and is probably going to lose duty-free, quota-free access to the European Union in about 2 years' time. And what does that mean to the industries that were built where the margins that you're making are dependent on the tariff moratorium that you're getting? So if the tariff is 30% and your margin is 25%, it means that without that tariff, you're going to probably have some problems, isn't it? But I'll get into the question of Bangladesh slightly later. So we started this thing in 2002. It was negotiated for quite a long time. So I'm the person who closed the agreement, but there were many before me. We started in 2002. In 2014, there was some agreement as to what the EPA should look like. And then a period of ratification came through. And it was Kenya and Rwanda that commenced this journey for the ratification process. That didn't work because as the EPA was designed, all countries had to ratify in order for it to come into force. So Kenya had a very interesting problem. This is a very large market for our flowers, tea, coffee, and other products. Our economy is changing, and I can't remember when we exited LDC status. So an instrument, a unilateral instrument, was put together by the EU called Market Access Regulation 1528/2007 that allowed provisionally access into that market as they allowed the region to basically sort out and finalize issues concerning this text. Up to today, we are still using that market access regulation to access the EU market until we finalize the ratification process of the agreement. Why is this not a good thing? It's not a good thing because it is a unilateral measure that can be withdrawn at any time. And it is not a measure which you can use to incentivize investment and industry. Why? When people are likely to invest, one of the key things they're very interested in is a long-term predictability so that they can source capital on a long-term basis. If you have a temporary market access instrument that has been issued unilaterally, then that does not inspire that kind of confidence, and it may retard in some way the kind of investments that you're able to get. So one of the things then that was our objective was to spur industry and investment because of the long-term predictability that we've been able to gain by signing the EPA. Now, variable geometry. I think what I would say here is that in 2021, because of the issues that I've described, the heads of states of the East African community, through their heads of states and government summit, recognized that Kenya was in a position whereby we were facing a different issue as compared to maybe our other brothers and sisters. And on 27th February 2021, there was a directive issued. If you just Google the Heads of State Summit of 2021, you will see that the heads of states applied the variable geometry principle to allow Kenya and any other country that was prepared to sign the EPA to move ahead and do so. And it is on this basis that then we reactivated our negotiations and managed now to conclude them at the end of last year. But a number of things changed. Over the last 20 years, it has been a very important issue in Europe and globally, the issue about climate change, environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it became imperative for us, in addition to doing the technical adjustments that were necessary to bilateralize a multilateral agreement, it also became important for us to be able to include aspects of sustainability because the world is not the same as it was 20 years ago. Because of that, we introduced a Trade for Sustainable Development chapter as part of the commitments in relation to the agreement. And now this goes back to what we were discussing with the Honorable the Dean and Head of Partnerships and your adjunct lecturer just this morning. And these are questions for the students. Trade agreements are no longer classical agreements that were based on reducing tariffs between countries so that you can stimulate trade. Trade agreements have moved on. Trade agreements are instruments for cooperation that are founded on trade matters, but often go beyond trade matters. Yet, those matters are typically contained within the trade agreement itself. And so this raises a very interesting perspective, which I would encourage many of you to research on, is what is then the new role of trade and trade agreements insofar as the contemporary political and economic issues are concerned, and to what extent can a trade agreement be used or utilized to advance matters beyond trade. For example, environment, human rights, labor, and several other topics. So we had this Trade for Sustainable Development chapter and its foundation, and if you listen to what His Excellency the President also says, he's emerged as a champion on issues of climate change. We are trying to ensure that we produce things sustainably. And so this is something that we are interested in, not merely because it's in an agreement, but because we also believe that you can produce sustainably. And when you produce sustainably, you are also able to attract markets where the consumer is more aware and the consumer is demanding for goods and services that are produced sustainably, and the consumer is typically, and in places like the EU, willing to pay a premium for that. So it is also a strategic decision for a country to build its capacity to trade, to manufacture sustainably, and to ensure that you're able to get into niche markets that reward a sustainably produced product. But that is something for another day. So we basically introduced a Trade for Sustainable Development chapter within this agreement, and we look forward to that being one of the pillars of this agreement. Now, what do we typically take to the EU? Tea, coffee, flowers, a lot of agricultural products, but we increasingly have ambitions to do more manufacturing that then can enable us to get more premium in that market. We are also interested in attracting investment from all over the world in a way that allows us to exercise the EU market. Let's go back to Bangladesh, where I started off from. Bangladesh is exporting, and maybe somebody can Google it, Bangladesh is exporting, I would think it's more than $1 billion worth of ready-made garments to the EU. But somebody can take a look and let us know. Kenya exports probably less than $10 million. Why the difference? About 20 or 30 years ago, I'm told trade ministers were getting into a conversation with the EU, and they were going to get some access arrangements done. But they say that let's have this as an LDC thing rather than an Africa thing. And those days, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on and so forth were also LDCs, but they seem to have done better and quicker and created markets that allowed them to access the EU with close to $1 billion of exports in just one sector. Now, in 2026, it's going to be exiting LDC status. What does that mean? That the manufacturing for ready-made garments, Kenya, for example, has an opportunity to attract investment from very senior producers that already have supply relationships with the EU for them to base their work here and to create jobs here and to build capacity here and for work to be done here and for investments to be done here and for jobs to be created here. So those are some of the fruits that we begin to think of when we think of the EU agreement. What is in the agreement itself? The agreement is covering a number of things. Number one is that we have instant, permanent, quarter-free, duty-free access to that market. On the side of the EU, it is not the same. Essentially, we have a situation whereby there are certain products which we have considered to be of a sensitive nature. For example, those in the sugarcane industry or in the dairy sector and many agricultural products. So those ones are not going to be liberalized on the tariff basis. But there are intermediate goods which we shall liberalize maybe by year 15. And then there are other goods which are of a more industrial nature, which when you look at the EAC Customs Union tariff are already zero rated, are things that will be allowing them to bring in either now or some of them in 7 years. So these are things like firefighting trucks, mining and construction, heavy equipment, and agricultural equipment that is complex. So these are things that we're not making, and we may not probably be making them some time to come, right? So when you do an analysis of that, you begin to see that we have fairly protected ourselves. If somebody was a fan of the infancy and industry argument, we have taken very good care to ensure that several of those sectors are not impacted, or at least immediately impacted, by the reduction of tariffs. But I'm told that dinosaurs had a small prayer that was quite effective. They used to say, God, all I need is a little more time. Yeah? And it worked very well and for quite some time, but we all know what happened at the end, isn't it? We don't see them anymore. Any country that gets into a trade agreement, even if the tariffs are going down in 25 years or 30 years, it basically means that you started the race, and you now also need to ensure that you take the internal measures to improve your competitiveness in such a way that you'll be able to export, because the time will come. Number two is that we have to look at how we can revolutionize this economy by exporting new things. I spoke about services. I spoke about digital trade. I spoke about all that kind of stuff. We need to make semiconductors. We need to make things using geothermal energy, whereby we are able to use the renewable energy that we have as a mark that basically shows sustainability, and so on and so forth. So I've spoken about what I think are some of the benefits. And maybe let me touch, perhaps finally, on what I would think is the central question behind the EAC, and whether some would say, is it okay for Kenya to negotiate trade agreements on a bilateral basis when we are part of the East African community? Those who read the treaty, I think there's a section there that allows for that to happen. And it allows for that to happen once the other partner states are also in agreement with that. But the interesting thing is that it says that one shall notify at the conclusion of such discussions with other partners. Not at the onset, but at the... So you can take a look at the treaty and let me know what it says, yeah? So then, of course, that allows countries that basically want to explore partnerships to proceed. On a de facto basis, what has happened? I was in Arusha on Friday last week, and the Council of Ministers have now agreed, not in respect of the EU agreement, but in respect of the Kenya-UK agreement, which was signed in 2018, which is of a similar nature, that the EAC now wants to follow in Kenya's footsteps, to basically now negotiate on the basis of the Kenya-UK agreement, an EAC-wide agreement. So this is also a situation whereby the other partner states have seen what Kenya has done and are saying that we also want in, and that now we'll be exercising that leadership as these negotiations are happening. Kenya is also having a conversation with the United States of America through something known as the Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership. We are currently not negotiating market access, but we are doing a so-called 21st century broad set of areas to do with digital trade, workers' protections, and that kind of stuff. And we are also having some conversations with other players. And what we begin to notice is that we typically seem to be taking the first move. And in many of the instances, we see that the rest of the community also then concurs with Kenya's steps and then comes up with a decision for us to now multilateralize what were previously bilateral conversations. I'd like to leave it there so that we can have more of a conversation. But a few things that I'd like to mention outside the EU, but as a practitioner who has a legal background like yourselves. We are confronting a world where things are changing a lot. New topics are coming up. And you guys really need to look at your law degree as a stepping stone for you to engage in areas that are previously not really considered to be, in the straight and narrow path of law. And the applicability of your law degree is vast. Because when I left law school, my first job was in the Treasury. I worked for the Ministry of Planning and National Development, where I was interacting with economists, and we did a lot of work to do with designing a governance program called African Peer Review Mechanism. We started working on trade. We did a bit of work on the short-term action plan for infrastructure for NEPAD, and stuff which not more than 10 or 15% of it could correlate with the things that I had studied the year before. But the farther I went from law, the more of law I found in those things that I was heading to. And so, if we are able to move into things like energy law, understanding international supply chains, understanding financial issues, then your law degree becomes an extremely powerful instrument for you to maintain a focus on legal study, but at the same time provide solutions to other sectors that may not intuitively look as though there are legal issues, but anywhere you go to, you'll find the law. So I'd just like to encourage you and wish you the very best as you conclude your examinations and as you conclude your degree, and see you on the other side. Thank you very much.